This is the Venturing Angler Podcast. I'm Tim Harden. In this episode, we'll be talking with Michael Caranci about fly fishing in Mongolia. Let's chat with Michael. All right, we're here talking Mongolia on the Venturing Angler Podcast with Michael Caranci. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So my understanding of Mongolia is pretty limited, I've got to say. I think that's because that's the case for a lot of people. When I worked for Wild on the Fly magazine, we covered Mongolia, and then there was I think one of the Trout Diaries films was in Mongolia. Both of these things are almost 20 years old, and so um, Mongolia emerges here and there. I think it's a destination that's seems so distant in so many people's minds that it sort of stays that way in a lot of ways. And so I'd love to break that down and talk about how accessible Mongolia is, how incredible it is, and everything in between. So I'm excited that you're here and welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you hit it spot on. It's not a new destination really. It's been known about for, since the 90s. It's been kind of on the radar since then, but a lot of people still are very unfamiliar with it. And it's often one of the first questions we get is, where is it?
That was my first one, and so I think hopefully by the end of this 3-hour podcast, everyone will be pretty familiar with all aspects of Mongolia. Just kidding about the 3 hours, it's unless that happens. You're like, oh my gosh, what did I sign up for? But let's start with the question you brought up. Where is it?
Yeah, it is one of the largest landlocked countries in the world, and it's surrounded by Russia to the north and China to the south. So it's in kind of the eastern part of the Asian mainland. And obviously, in this day and age, those are interesting neighbors to have. But yeah, so it's right there, and it's actually easy to get to. Surprisingly, distance-wise, you got to cross the Pacific Ocean. But there's lots and lots of flights to get into mainland hubs in Asia. Seoul's one of my favorite. A lot of people go through Beijing. You can go through China. You can go the other way through Moscow. We get a lot of European anglers that come that way, or Turkey works as well. And then from any of those major hubs, it's a short flight into the capital city of Ulaanbaatar. So pretty easy to get there. Logistically wise, takes a little bit of time in a plane, but not too bad. And then you're there.
About how long does it take?
Usually you get one long flight, from a major hub into one of those major Asian hubs. I know going through Seoul, it's usually around 11 hours or so going and around 9 coming back with the tailwinds.
Okay, so it's not too much harder to get to than a lot of the other, destinations we cover on this podcast, whether it's Patagonia
not at
or
all.
Kamchatka and all that. So,
yeah, it's always interesting to me because people heading north to south, they never seem to mind the distance. Like, oh, going to Argentina is no big deal. It's the same amount of flight time to go there as it is to cross over to, the Asian mainland. So, but going east to west always kind of trips people's minds a little bit.
That's funny. I think it's because Mongolia is known as such a remote destination that I think maybe that is something that is a factor too. It makes people think, oh, it must be impossible to get there. Once one arrives to the airport, what happens next?
Yeah, and actually the remoteness ties in directly with one of the many things that's unique about Mongolia, because it's a very large country, but it's also the least densely populated country in the world. So the vast majority of the population lives at least part of the year in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital city. So anybody coming there to fish, they end up flying into UB, and that's a major metropolitan hub. It's, I think, 3 million people or so. And so in there, you got all the amenities of any major city. There's lots of restaurants. There's some great cultural sites and activities. And so most people, on all of our trips, people come and included in the package is the night in UB on either end of the trip, coming and going. and we include free tours around the town while you're there. And a lot of people, because Mongolia is such a unique place, they'll come and spend some extra time either doing more stuff in and around the city or getting out and doing some of the other things. But as far as the trips go, you get there to UB, fairly simple, spend the night, have dinner, relax, and then normally the next day we head into the camps. And that's where you start getting into the remote side of things. On the two different rivers we operate on, one river is a little bit harder to get to, and that one we do a commercial flight. It's about 90 minutes to a smaller town called Moron, and then from there, drive overland anywhere from 3 to 6 hours to get to the first camp. And that's where you really get a sense for the vast steppe of Mongolia, just driving over grasslands. There's no real roads. The roads are a couple dirt tracks cutting across the grassland, going four-wheel driving across rivers and over mountains. And pretty amazing trek, and all the different things that you'll see from, camels roaming around the middle of nowhere, the nomads, and all that sort of stuff. And the other river, we do a charter flight and fly directly to the river, and then from there it's pretty close to get to the river. But yeah, you get a real sense through both of those, either through the flight in the small plane or the overland trek, to really get a sense of how vast and open this country is. Because outside of that capital city, it's everybody for the most part lives the nomadic lifestyle still. They live in the traditional gers, which most people think of as yurts, but the Mongolians did them first, and they call them gers. It's kind of felt round hut-like buildings that you see that look so cool, and you'll see those just randomly scattered all over the place. Most Mongolians, they move 4 times a year, and they just have their herds. There's no fences, there's no real private land ownership. It's really a trip back in time to what the American West must have looked like a few hundred years ago.
Yeah, when you described that long drive, that appeals to me. That's where you really get to see the country. And so I know some people can't stand being in the car, but some of my most memorable trips and parts of those trips are when I'm in the car on the way to the destination and seeing so much of the terrain. So I can't imagine how special that is in a place like Mongolia.
It is. It's really cool. It's amazing the stuff you see. You're just out in the middle of nowhere, but it's one of the interesting dichotomies of Mongolia, because you have this vast open area that is in many ways wilderness, but in other ways it's not wilderness because the people do live there. They're just very spread out. So you're driving over, you'll see just randomly somebody on a motorbike, or guy on horseback herding his camels across the steppe. I remember one time just in the middle of nowhere, you couldn't see anything around for miles, and there's a basketball hoop on a post and two kids playing basketball in the grassland. Like, where does that come from? So the sort of stuff you see out there, it is interesting because it's a beautiful drive. It'd be like driving across Montana. You get the Altai Mountains at the back, and the rolling grasslands and hills at the steppe in between, and so it's a beautiful drive, and there's lots to see. It is very interesting.
That's great. Well, people who are listening and people who have been there that we know have gone there for one reason, probably above all else, and that's the fish. And so let's dive in. I'm excited about this part as much as anything else. And so what are people going there for when it comes to fish?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We always say people oftentimes go there the first time for the fish, and then they start coming back for the place, the people, the culture, cool, and all that sort of stuff. So there's a lot more to talk about there too. But yeah, the fish are obviously a good place to start. And that's even quite a bit more diverse, I think, than most people realize. The big draw, certainly for most anglers, is the taimen, which is the largest salmon head on Earth. So it's just the biggest member of the trout family. And it's a really cool, unique fish. They call them the river wolf. And they can get up to 50 inches or 60 inches or larger. And a fish, in that 40, 50 inch plus class is usually going to be 40 to 50 years old. They're really unique predators in that regard. And they don't act like a normal trout in that sense because they are such a big predator. They migrate huge expanses of territory on their rivers. Our programs are also huge conservation projects, so we track the fish pretty closely and study them. And, we see fish that move 200 kilometers during the course of a season sometimes.
Wow.
And so they're great big, massive trout that'll eat just about anything. One of the Mongolians are not a big fishing culture in general, but what fishing that they did traditionally was usually they'd catch like a marmot or something and put it on a giant hook and throw it out there and hand line it back. I mean, that's how aggressive these fish are. They eat. Their main food source is bait fish. Obviously, they eat the trout and grayling that are in the rivers, but they eat mice, rodents, anything. So they're a very good topwater fish as well. So the fishing for them is fun. They could be anywhere. They're hunters, so you kind of cover the water, fish shallow water, deep water. You'll sight fish for them sometimes. They'll be cruising in the shallows, hunting for grayling that push up into the edges of the river. They have a lot of topwater fishing, poppers, gurglers is one of the guide's favorite flies to fish for them. And the attack is just monumental. I mean, they'll come clear out of the water. A lot of times they actually will eat the topwater pattern on the way down. And because they have very hard mouth structure, a lot of times you miss on that first strike and you keep going and they keep hitting it again and again and again. It'll take sometimes 6 or 7 tries before you actually get the hook in their mouth, if you do it all. So just a very exciting fish because of the potential size and just the aggressiveness of them and the way that they take flies is really unique.
So they're so big. I'm trying to understand how they even hunt, and so the topwater makes sense because their prey might not see them. And then with respect to things like grayling, are they cornering them on the banks, or how's that working?
Yeah, in general, you don't find the trout species in the center of the river very much. They
Right.
get pushed to the sides. So even when we're fishing for trout and grayling, a lot of times we're found in the banks because that's where they're hanging out in those shallows where they might have a chance of seeing a big taimen coming. And for that reason too, we'll oftentimes see the taimen in those waters. They do cruise along those banks and the shallow flats, and they have this very distinct red tail that pops out on a clear sunny day, which is a lot of the days over there. So you'll be rowing along, casting, blind casting, covering water, and then all of a sudden, boom, you see that telltale, tail that's several feet long, just sitting there in the shallows, and it's game on.
And when you're not on the surface, what's that strike like? Is it a pretty fast, aggressive strike so that they can sort of compensate for their size that might be more visible to their prey?
Yeah, generally the attacks are very memorable. I mean, they hit hard. It's very seldom that you get a subtle take, and that's a lot of what the fun is in fishing for them. It's just the way that they hit the fly. Like I said, a lot of times, even on subsurface patterns, because very rarely are we fishing sinking lines. Even if we're fishing streamers, it's predominantly floating line work. You're seeing the fly, and so you see this, you see the take as much as you feel it, even when you're streaming fishing a lot of the time. And so it's something you don't forget.
And what flies are customary down there?
Fish bait fish patterns that tend to imitate trout or grayling. The guides have a favorite. They call it Chilean goat. It's just kind of a white streamer. Black and tan flies work well. They cast a silhouette in the water. And then top water gurglers, as I mentioned, is a favorite because it's like a large mouse on the water and it's easy to cast. But you can be creative too. Mark Johnstad, who founded those programs, his main fly he always fishes, we call it a happy meal. It's just a giant foam popper head with rubber legs on it that we draw a smiley face on and a little rabbit strip behind it with a hook. And he hooks more fish on that fly than anything.
That's great.
And man, the guides it's a great place for people that tie flies because they can get super creative. Pike style flies, long bodies are really popular. The Blaine chocolate type stuff, and just anything that might elicit a strike from a angry predator. So you can really have some fun if you're a tyer and be creative and just try to make something up that is going to piss off an angry predator. They're not selective fish.
No, that's great. I just was staring up at the ceiling thinking about what these strikes would be like, and then suddenly wanting to go there more than I ever have. What gear? I imagine the tippet's got to be pretty thick, but what gear are you going with generally?
Yeah, I mean, you think kind of like they're not tippet shy, so you can get away with just about anything. Because a lot of times we are fishing larger flies, although you don't have to. They'll eat small flies too. Small meaning like 2 or 3 inches. But yeah, so like anywhere from 20-pound on the light side to 40-pound. A lot of times we'll just pull off, 3 or 4 feet a straight 30 or 40-pound test and give it a go. And then rod wise, you're fishing 8, 9 weights are the most common. Some people bring a 10 and they're fine for casting heavier stuff, but it's a lot of rod to cast all day. So, 8 or 9 weights, perfect for most situations. Predominantly single-handed rods because we cover a lot of water in the boats, but there's weight opportunities as well. So some anglers bring switch or spay rods, and those also can work well.
I was chatting with someone last week and said I was going to be doing a podcast with you about taimen, and he's like, "Oh no, there's a lot of fish to talk about there." And so grayling came up, but I'm going to leave it pretty open for you to jump in on some of the more exciting species. I had no idea that, it's people who go there are often going for the diversity of species there.
Yeah, we actually have one group that comes every year. They've been coming for 2 to 3 weeks a year now for almost a decade, and they don't even fish for taimen when they come. They come just for the trout fishing. And depending on the river, there's a couple different species available. Our western operation, we have trout and grayling. The species of trout there is called a lennox. It's kind of a prehistoric version of a trout, and they look a lot like kind of a funny looking fish. They almost have a mouth like a whitefish and the body like a cutthroat or something. Pretty coloration and spots, and they tend to average 16 to 22 inches. So, and people that really target them certain times a year, they can catch 80 to 100 trout like that in a day. It's incredible trout fishing. And the other river that we have also has lennox in it, and it also has a very rare species of trout called an Amur trout that live only in the Amur Basin, rivers that flow into the Amur. And they're typically large. They'll eat the same flies as the taimen do. We rarely see them under 22 inches or so. And they're one of the guide's favorites because they are so rare, but we can tend to catch them during the course of a week as well. And there's some incredible Amur pike in that river too. So pike fishing can be a lot of fun. And it's another favorite species that's, just different and unique, and they hit just like a taimen do. So
how big can this pike get?
They tend to average 25 to 40 inches, kind of in that range, with most of them being in the 30 to 35 inch range. So it's like a medium sized taimen. Mm-hmm.
And with respect to these fish, other than the pike, where do they exist outside of Mongolia?
Lennox are pretty common fish throughout Asia. So you'll see them in a lot of that Eastern Asia area. They'd be like the, rainbow trout of the North America sort of thing. Amur trout, though, they're much more rare. So you only see them in a few river basins over there. So you don't see a lot of those fish outside of a couple rivers that flow into the Amur. And a lot of those rivers have been fished out, especially on the China side. So don't see those fish very often.
And then for all these fish that aren't taimen, what gear considerations should people have, especially with respect to rods and flies?
Yeah, think anything you'd fish in Montana or Chile or Argentina. Just 4, 5, 6 weight rods, general trout stuff. They're not pressured fish, so 3x tippet is fine. You can go 4x if you want. You don't have to. And just generic flies. We do a lot of hopper dropper sort of stuff. There are a lot of grasshoppers on those rivers in the later seasons. Chubby Chernobyls with a beaded red copper john below it, something like that, will typically catch fish all day long. So
then when it comes to seasons, what are you guys looking at for seasons in Mongolia?
The season overall is a pretty long one there. The opening of the legal fishing season is June 15th and runs through November 15th or November 1st. Off the top of my head, I can't think of that right now. We end up kind of leaving the river around late October just because it starts getting cold. So that's the general season. On the 2 rivers we operate on, there are different elevations and they're quite diverse geographically. So they have different seasons in their own right. The western operation with Fish Mongolia, that is it's higher elevation, so that one fishes great in June, July, and August. It can fish well, and we have in seasons past fished all the way through September there. But because of the elevation, it just starts getting cold there as we get into September. So now we typically start wrapping up operations there around the end of August. And then the other river is lower elevation. So while it's temperate enough in the summertime, it can fish in the summer. That's kind of a rainy period in that eastern part of Mongolia. So it's just a little bit riskier from a water condition standpoint. So we usually don't start fishing that until the end of August, when the water conditions are more stable, into that dry period. So it's, August, September through October is the main time on that river.
And is the weather pretty standard for a hilly or mountainous region? How hot and cold does it tend to get?
On both those rivers through the seasons where we're on, you think about the comparable climate in Montana is going to be, kind of what we're looking at. So it is very common to be wearing shorts and a t-shirt and wet wading, but you also have to be prepared every day for storms to move in, and you could be sunny and warm one minute and have it snow in the next, any time of the year. It's blue sky country, so we get blue skies more than anything else, but weather can change quickly in the mountains.
So I've known you for several years, and you've been a lot of places. You've been to the Amazon, you've been to the Caribbean. We could go on and on. You've made the professional decision, which I'm sure connects to interest, to really focus on Mongolia. Why? What is it about Mongolia that has you really wanting to put so much of yourself into this destination?
Yeah, I was very fortunate for almost a decade that I was able to travel all over the world. I managed the operations in Kamchatka, did a lot of the saltwater stuff with the fly shops. I was all over the Seychelles and the Caribbean and the Pacific, and explored a lot of new destinations that, first angler ever on them and things like that, and did a lot of stuff in the Amazon. And so I was very fortunate to have an opportunity to see a lot of the world and loved all of it. And for me, the fly rod has always been kind of the excuse to go to these places and to get to know the places and the people and the culture. And um, everywhere I've been has been unique and special. But Mongolia, to me, just it wasn't like anywhere else. The fishing is exciting, but it's about so much more than that there. The people are the nicest I've encountered anywhere in the world. They're just wonderful, amazing people, and the culture is incredible. Just the history with Genghis Khan and nomadic lifestyle, and there's just so much culture there that is a part of all of our trips, and is a part of every minute that you spend in that country. You're immersed in the people and the culture, and the place itself as well is just beautiful, it's spectacular, as pretty as anywhere I've been anywhere in the world, and you get that remote wilderness feeling that I love. I don't like being around people in general, and it's a great place for that because there's not a lot of people, and so it's just so interesting to me that it really beckoned to me. And then there's also the conservation side. I'm a big conservationist. I do a lot of volunteer work, with Trout Unlimited. I have for years helped start a chapter here in our area, and I'm still on the board of that and do a lot of work there. And when I was at the fly shop, I did a lot of conservation work in a lot of the programs. And our programs in Mongolia are the whole impetus for why they were started, and the whole reason why we do what we do there with the fishing is to protect taimen. And so that part's really interesting. And we do, the guides go up pre-season and do river cleanups. We work closely with the local communities, to try to educate them on the importance of taimen, and how they can better their lives in those remote communities by having these fish in the river and protecting them. And so that part of it just drew on a whole nother side of things that I'm passionate about. So I get to not only help share this special part of the world with people, but get to help work to protect it as well. And so that's pretty critical. Taimen's an amazing fish, and because of their unique life history and size and everything, that they are very susceptible to impacts, and we've seen that. I mean, have one of the widest distributions out of any fish in the world, and yet now there's only a handful of rivers left in the world where you can really find them in good populations, because you take a 50-inch taimen out of the river and it takes 50 years to grow another one. So it's really important work that we do above and all else.
Have you found that that work is having an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. On the two different rivers we operate on, the eastern program with Mongolia River Outfitters, that was the first designated taimen sanctuary. It got established with the government that way in 2008. And then we added the Fish Mongolia River a few years later. And just even the difference in those few years, we see the difference in those rivers, because there's even higher populations of taimen on the river that's been protected longer. And as we've been protecting the other river now too, we're seeing taimen populations come up just by education and keeping poachers off the river. That's the biggest threat over there, really. So yeah, we're absolutely seeing benefits.
Michael, when we first started really touching base about Mongolia, I think it was at the beginning of 2020, and COVID certainly put things on hold. How have you guys been impacted with the pandemic?
Like so many in the world this year, we've been severely impacted. Our fishing programs, anyway, and the country has in many ways. Although Mongolia really handled the pandemic arguably better than anybody else in the world. They're because of their proximity to China, they reacted very early on, and they closed the border to China back in January, almost a year ago. They were the first country to do so, and as it started spreading, they closed the border down completely just about a month after that. So late February, early March, I think. They completely shut the border off. They wouldn't even let their own citizens come home, which actually impacted a couple of our guides they came over here in the U.S. to spend some time with me working at some of the fly fishing shows, and they couldn't get home. And so they just completely locked off the borders. They kept the virus out of the country. They would slowly bring citizens back on repatriation flights, and anybody coming back was instantly put into quarantine for 21 days.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing. And by doing that, they kept the virus out. They canceled some of their major celebrations, the Lunar New Year, which is a huge celebration in the late winter, early spring. And so they really protected their citizens. And part of that's cultural. They have a long, very prideful history going back to, Genghis Khan, when he united the nomads and really conquered the known world and had the largest empire the world's ever seen. And they're very proud of that, and they stick to that. And so they were perfectly content to just take care of their own. And they did a great job of that. And they kept the virus out. By this summer, they were pretty much life as normal inside the country. People weren't wearing masks. Businesses were open. They got to have their Naadam celebrations in July, which is a big deal. And they did great. And unfortunately, back November 7th, I believe, a Russian truck driver that came across the border, quarantined for 21 days, tested negative 3 times, and then somehow went out to a concert and tested positive, and they had their first cases of community spread. So that was a bummer, but they instantly kind of locked everything back down, and did extensive contact tracing, tracked everything down, and as of a month ago, they were starting to gradually reopen things back up again as they had a grip on it. So they've just done an exceptional job. It did mean that we had to cancel our whole 2020 season, which of course was a bummer. But we were just very appreciative. All of our guests were very understanding. We were commended through a lot of the agents that we work with around the world on how good our policy was in terms of letting everybody rebook for future seasons. Didn't charge any penalties like so many operators did. And so we just rebooked everybody for 2021 and 2022. And now everybody's just anxiously waiting for things to open back up. And with all the recent good news with vaccinations and things like that, of course, we still don't know. The borders are still closed, but we're very hopeful that we'll be back on the river, hopefully in just a few months.
Good. A question that that guests don't like me to ask, but listeners do, is about memorable trips or memorable experiences. And the reason it goes both ways is, how could you possibly, you know, answer that question when you spend so much time there and have had so many experiences. But I'm gonna throw it at you anyway and see what we can get. So
Oh,
yeah, go ahead.
oh, totally. I mean, how much time do we have here? Because I could, this could be a 12-hour long show.
We can always just let it go till the SD card's full.
There you go. Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that's so cool about Mongolia is it's such a random place and it's such a big adventure that there's just things happen, and to be honest, a lot of times they're outside of the realm of the fishing. There's certainly memorable fishing things, the taimen that hits the fly 10 different times, you hook them, you lose them, think it's game over, you flip it back out and he comes back again. I mean, those happen often over there, so those are always memorable. I can remember a lot of those. But I think some of my favorite memories are almost when things go wrong, and you just make these amazing stories out of it. My first, I'll tell just a couple. My first trip over there, we came in a few days early and was there with a group of guests, and we decided to go see some cultural stuff outside of the city before going to the river. We took a trip one day, a couple hours out into the steppe to go visit with a nomad family and have lunch with them and meet their family and just see how they really live out on the steppe. And it was an amazing experience, top to bottom. But the part that always really sticks out is on the way back. We were in this bus just driving across the grassland, and the driver high centered the bus on a little hill, and we got stuck, just totally stuck. Looking around, you see nothing but grass for miles, and within minutes, guy on a motorbike pulls up with a kid on the back, and guy on horseback rides up, and another, like a Toyota 4Runner, I think, with a family, and it pulls up. And all these just random people get out and they start helping us. And of course, the bus had no tools or anything, and one little tiny jack. And they just, these kids are running around, and the guy on the motorcycle happened to have a shovel head on his motorcycle for some reason, and we found a stick to tie it to and started using that to try to dig the front bumper out while the bus driver's underneath trying to jack the car up with this little tiny jack. And the guy in the 4Runner hooks up a thin little wire to try to drag it out. Of course, the wire breaks. It's just such a comedy of errors, but such a fun experience. All these people just randomly showing up to help, and the kids start wrestling in the grass. And after an hour or so, we got it out and said goodbye to everybody and continued on our way. And they all went separate directions, and it was like nothing ever happened. But I mean, that sort of stuff is just amazing to me that it can and does happen, and it was really cool.
Yeah, that is special. That's unique. It reminds me. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. Well, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
There's a scene where he goes to the ends of the earth, and it's to see basically a photographer taking a photo of a snow leopard. But they end up becoming more interested in playing soccer with a bunch of kids who are playing soccer at the bottom of this mountain. And yeah, like that's in some ways kind of cooler than the snow leopard. And so, those experiences are the ones that you remember.
Yep.
So I cut you off though. It sounded like you were going to go into another one, and I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. No, and that's spot on. It's those stories that really make trips memorable. So yeah, but yeah, another one is on another trip to Mongolia. We were floating down the river, and on that particular stretch of river, we go into a national park. It's one of the few places where we can't set up the traditional gears that guests usually stay in. So there we use big tent teepees, which are also real spacious and comfortable, and very aesthetic without leaving an impact in the national park, which is nice. But one night, it was a beautiful, clear night. We ate a lovely dinner, and then we were sitting out looking at the stars, and everybody went to bed and didn't think anything of it. And then all of a sudden, like midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning or something, I kind of sort of started waking up. I could hear the winds picking up. It's like, it's getting windy. Huh, interesting. I remember thinking, oh shit, I got laundry out on the line behind the tent. I hope it doesn't blow away. And then a second later, there was this whoosh. And I kind of opened my eyes and looked up and I could see the stars. And I sat up and looked around and all the teepees had blown away.
Wow.
And so all the guests are sitting up, kind of half awake, looking around. And one of the Mongolian staff, it's a kid named Soilo, who's just amazing. Everybody loves Soilo. He's always smiling, and no matter what, he comes running up and he says, "Excuse me, everyone. We have a weather emergency. Please go to the dining tent." So everybody's scrambling. It's windy. We're grabbing our clothes and throwing them in bags and trying to get everything in before the rain started. And all the wonderful staff, because there's an army of staff on these rivers between the guides and the boat crews and the cooks and the gear families and everybody. They're just running around like crazy. And all the guests ended up sleeping in the kitchen tent that night. But by the time we woke up, the tents were all set back up, and it was like nothing had ever happened. They worked all night to get everything back together. It's just testament to the amazing people there. And but it was a fun adventure.
That sounds fun. So, Michael, to end the podcast, tell us about these operations.
Yeah, so it's two different companies essentially that work together, Mongolia River Outfitters and Fish Mongolia. And each operation focuses on a different river. And you'll notice that we're really careful about not mentioning the names of the rivers. And that's just to protect them, because Mongolia is such an open place. Literally one of the biggest threats that these fish face is poaching. People from Russia and Eastern Europe, they will sometimes come and try to drive, rent a car or drive over the border from Russia and go poach these rivers out. So one of the ways that we protect them is just try to avoid mentioning the names. And that has worked fairly well. We spend a lot of time still working with local authorities. It is actually illegal for international anglers to fish on those rivers without getting a fishing permit through the local SUMs. And so we're able to have patrols and work with the local governments to kind of keep that from impacting these fisheries. So yeah, the Mongolia River Outfitters program, we operate on a river in kind of northeastern Mongolia that flows into the Amur River and then out to the Pacific Ocean. And the Fish Mongolia program is a river in kind of northwestern Mongolia that it flows eventually into Lake Baikal, largest inland lake in the world. It's almost like inland ocean in its own right. So two different regions. Eastern operation is kind of the typical Mongolian steppe. You get the rolling grasslands. You go through a couple majestic scenic canyons, very beautiful. And then the Western River flows through the Altai Mountains. It's just absolutely spectacular. So one of the prettiest river floats you'll ever see. And they're all float trips. So we have different camps every single night. Incredible team of staff, all Mongolians. We do import a couple guides that have been with us from Chile for a long, long time. And of course, the famous Peter Fong, American expat, lives in Morocco now. He's been a long part of the program. So we have really great guides, and they've been there for lots and lots of years. They work really closely together, along with our incredible Mongolian staff, to just make the experience memorable for everybody, every step of the way, from the time you get off the plane the time you get into the camp, and every night, smiling faces along the way, and from wrestling and to singing around the campfire. They make this a true Mongolian experience, top to bottom, and get to see 10 to 14 miles of river every day. You can get out and wade as much as you want, or cover water in the boats. Both could be effective, and enjoy the openness of this beautiful country and fishing for some incredible trout fishing and the most unique species of trout in the world.
That sounds amazing. Where can folks go to learn more?
Two different websites for each program. You got mongoliarivers.com and fishmongolia.com, and you can find out a lot on both of those. And of course, we also have a good presence on social media. Fish Mongolia for Instagram and Facebook, and there's lots of photos and videos there as well.
Great. It's funny. I realized as I asked that question, I always ask that, where can people go to learn more? It'd be funny if you just said Mongolia. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know why I always ask it that way, but that sounds great. And yeah, I've, browsing through these websites, um, it really, these fish are really something else. And of course, the, uh, the whole experience is what it's all about. But, the 50-year-old salmonid sounds pretty special. And then those other fish, there's a great deal that's offered out of Mongolia. And so I'm really glad to have had the conversation with you. And I certainly learned more about a place that already seemed impressive. And, I'm sure the listeners feel the same way. So thank you for the time. And folks, be sure to go online and learn more about these destinations.
Sounds good. Thanks. We'll look forward to seeing everybody in Mongolia soon.
Great. Thanks, Michael.
All right. Thanks.